the fastest way to lose power is to assume your title can unlock someone else's door. On Monday morning at 7:12, Daniel Harper stood inside the office of Harper Auto Works with a storage record folder in one hand and a fresh invoice on the counter, watching Margaret Caldwell glare at him through the glass as if the entire building had personally insulted her. Behind Daniel, inside the service bay, sat Margaret's silver Mercedes, polished, untouched, and parked exactly where no vehicle was supposed to remain without permission, paperwork, or a work order. The workshop was not a community garage. It was not a favor closet for Willow Creek Estates. It was a private business on a commercial parcel outside the homeowners association boundary, with posted policies, cameras, insurance rules, and a schedule that depended on every bay being used for actual customers. Margaret knew that. She had been told before. She had seen the sign herself. But that morning she stood outside in a cream blazer with her phone in her hand, demanding that Daniel open the roll-up door immediately because she had an important board call at 8 o'clock and no time for what she called a misunderstanding. Daniel did not unlock the garage. He did not raise his voice. He did not step outside where she could turn the conversation into a scene. He simply opened the office window enough to speak clearly and said the vehicle would be released after the standard procedure was completed. Margaret's expression tightened. "You cannot charge the homeowners association president for a misunderstanding," she said. Daniel looked at the Mercedes, then at the posted storage policy mounted beside the office door, then back at her. "I am not charging the homeowners association president," he said. "I am charging the person who left a vehicle in my workshop without permission." That sentence landed harder than any argument would have, because it removed the title she wanted to hide behind. Margaret glanced toward the clubhouse path across the rear road, where two early walkers from Willow Creek Estates had slowed down to watch. She lowered her voice, but not her attitude. She said she had only left the Mercedes there overnight because the clubhouse parking lot was crowded after a charity event, and a decent neighbor would have understood. Daniel opened the folder and turned the first page toward the window. It showed a still image from the service bay camera. Friday night, 8:43 in the evening, Margaret driving into the open workshop while Daniel was in the back storage room receiving a late parts delivery. The next still showed her standing beside the Mercedes, looking directly at the policy board that read unauthorized vehicles left inside the workshop will be billed daily as indoor storage until released through written procedure. Margaret looked away from the page almost immediately. Daniel did not need to add emotion to it. The camera had already done the part words usually ruined. He explained that there was no intake form, no signed work order, no written storage approval, no key drop record, and no permission from him or anyone employed by Harper Auto Works. Until Margaret signed the acknowledgement and paid the indoor storage invoice, the vehicle would remain exactly where it was, locked inside, documented, and untouched. She called it unreasonable. He called it policy. She called it disrespectful. He called it liability. And while Margaret stood outside trying to turn a private mistake into a community issue, Daniel already understood what she did not. The Mercedes was not the thing truly stuck in his workshop. Her authority was. 3 weeks before Margaret Caldwell stood outside Daniel Harper's office demanding the Mercedes back, Harper Auto Works had been running with the quiet rhythm Daniel had worked years to build. The shop sat at the edge of a small commercial strip behind Willow Creek Estates, close enough for residents to see the roll-up door from the rear clubhouse road, but far enough on paper that the homeowners association had no authority over the building, the parking spaces, or the way Daniel ran his schedule. It was not a large operation. There was one main service bay, one smaller side bay, a parts room, a clean office with a coffee maker that had seen better days, and a wall where Daniel kept every policy posted in plain language. Customers liked him because he was predictable. If he said a brake job would be ready by 4 o'clock, it was usually ready by 3:30. If a part was delayed, he called before the customer had to ask. If a vehicle stayed overnight, there was an intake form, a key tag, a work order, and a written record of why it was there. Daniel believed small businesses survived on trust, but he also knew trust needed paper behind it. That was why the storage policy had been posted beside the office door for more than 2 years. It was not hidden in fine print or invented for a problem after the fact. The sign was printed in black letters on a white board and read clearly. Unauthorized vehicles left inside the workshop will be billed daily as indoor storage until released through written procedure. Underneath it were the daily rate, the release requirements, and a note that no vehicle would be moved, serviced, or released without proper documentation. Most customers barely noticed it because most customers respected boundaries. Margaret Caldwell noticed everything, but only when she wanted control over it. She first came into the shop on a Tuesday afternoon wearing a cream blazer and the kind of smile that felt more like a meeting notice than a greeting. She introduced herself as the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, then looked around the workshop as if she were inspecting a property she had already decided needed improvement. Daniel wiped his hands on a clean towel and listened while she explained that residents had concerns about the appearance of businesses near the rear entrance. She mentioned the shop lights, the delivery trucks, the number of vehicles visible through the open bay, and the impression it created for a high-standard community. Daniel answered calmly. He showed her the business license, the zoning approval, and the property map that placed Harper Auto Works outside the association boundary. Margaret accepted the papers with a polite nod, but her expression barely changed. She said legality and neighborliness were not always the same thing. Daniel remembered that sentence because people usually said something like that when the law was not on their side. After she left, he saved a copy of the conversation summary in his business records, not because he expected trouble, but because Margaret had spoken about cooperation in a way that sounded less like a request and more like a warning. At the time, he thought the issue would stay limited to emails about lights and parking. He did not yet know she would soon treat his workshop like an extra room attached to her clubhouse. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret Caldwell proved that her first visit had not been a casual introduction. Her emails began arriving in Daniel Harper's inbox with subject lines that sounded professional but carried the same message underneath. She wanted Harper Auto Works to behave as though Willow Creek Estates controlled it. On Wednesday, she wrote about delivery trucks using the rear road before 8 o'clock in the morning, even though that road served the commercial strip and not just the neighborhood clubhouse. On Friday, she complained that customers occasionally parked facing the wrong direction while waiting for the bay to open, even though the spaces belonged to Daniel's landlord. The following Monday, she asked whether Daniel could keep the roll-up door closed during community events because, in her words, visible repair activity affected the appearance of the entrance corridor. Daniel answered every message the same way. He stayed polite, attached the relevant property map, explained the zoning approval, and repeated that Harper Auto Works was a private business outside the homeowners association boundary. He never wrote more than necessary, because Margaret had a way of pulling long explanations into emotional arguments. If he gave her facts, she responded with community standards. If he gave her boundaries, she responded with neighborly cooperation. If he gave her documents, she responded with phrases like shared expectations and reasonable flexibility. Daniel began saving every email in a folder labeled Caldwell Communications, not because any single message crossed a line, but because together they showed a pattern. Margaret was not asking for cooperation. She was testing how many times she could make him defend the obvious. The clearest warning came on a Thursday afternoon, when Margaret entered the shop while Daniel was finishing paperwork for a customer. She stood near the office door, directly beside the storage policy sign, and told him the clubhouse was hosting a charity dinner the next evening. Parking would be tight, she said, and several board members were concerned about vehicle security. Then she asked if Daniel could let her leave her Mercedes inside the workshop for a few hours during the event. Daniel did not hesitate. He said indoor space was only for customer vehicles with signed intake forms, active work orders, or written storage approval through the business. Margaret smiled as if he had misunderstood the size of the favor. She said it would only be one car, one night, and surely he could make an exception for the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Daniel pointed to the policy board beside her and explained that the rule existed because vehicles inside the workshop created insurance responsibility, security responsibility, and scheduling problems. Margaret looked at the sign, read enough of it to understand the meaning, and then looked back at him with a colder expression. She said Daniel was making it difficult for the community to see him as a good neighbor. Daniel answered that being a good neighbor did not require turning a private workshop into event parking. She left without shouting, but the way she paused near the open bay told him the conversation was not finished. That night, Daniel added a short note to the Caldwell Communications folder, requested indoor storage for Mercedes during clubhouse event. Request denied. Policy shown in person. He thought that note might matter later. He had no idea how soon. Friday evening arrived with the kind of busy schedule Daniel Harper normally liked. The charity dinner at the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse was already filling the rear road with polished cars and soft music drifting across the commercial strip, while Daniel stayed late at Harper Auto Works to receive a delayed parts delivery that had missed its afternoon window. He had one customer vehicle in the side bay, one empty space in the main service bay, and a delivery driver waiting outside with several boxes of brake components and a heavy crate that needed to be checked before Daniel could lock up. At 8:18 in the evening, Daniel opened the roll-up door, turned on the bay lights, and guided the delivery truck close enough to unload without blocking the rear road. Across the way, the clubhouse looked bright and crowded, but Daniel kept his attention on the parts list, the crate labels, and the driver's paperwork. He was in the back storage room comparing part numbers when the security camera above the front corner recorded Margaret Caldwell's silver Mercedes turning slowly off the clubhouse drive and into the open workshop entrance. The footage would later show everything with uncomfortable clarity. Margaret drove past the customer parking spaces, past the side entrance, and directly into the main service bay as if she had been expected. She stopped the Mercedes neatly inside the painted work lines, turned off the headlights, and sat for a moment while the bay lights reflected across the hood. Then she stepped out with her handbag, closed the door, and looked around the workshop. She did not appear confused. She did not call Daniel's name. She did not walk toward the back storage room. Instead, she moved toward the office door and paused directly beside the storage policy sign she had been shown the day before. The camera captured her face turning toward the board, reading it long enough for the moment to matter. Unauthorized vehicles left inside the workshop will be billed daily as indoor storage until released through written procedure. Underneath that line were the rate, the release requirements, and the warning that no vehicle would be moved or released without documentation. Margaret looked at the sign, then toward the clubhouse lights outside, then back at the Mercedes. A minute later, she walked out through the open bay door and crossed the rear road toward the clubhouse dinner. Daniel did not see her. He was still in the storage room with the delivery driver, checking the crate and signing the receipt. By the time he came back into the main bay, the Mercedes was partly hidden from his angle behind the open delivery truck and a stack of box parts. He noticed the silver shape, but assumed for a moment it belonged to the driver's vehicle outside or to a customer who had pulled close while he was busy. The delivery ran late. The driver needed an extra signature, and Daniel was focused on closing correctly after a long day. At 9:06, the truck pulled away. Daniel turned off the rear storage lights, checked the side bay, set the alarm for the office, and lowered the roll-up door according to his normal routine. The Mercedes remained inside, locked safely under the cameras, exactly where Margaret had left it. Daniel drove home tired, unaware that the most expensive object in his workshop that night was not the car itself, but the assumption behind it. Saturday morning was supposed to begin with a simple oil service, a tire rotation, and a customer pickup before noon, but Daniel Harper knew something was wrong the moment he lifted the roll-up door and saw the silver Mercedes sitting in the middle of the main service bay. For a few seconds, he stood at the entrance with the keys in his hand, letting the scene arrange itself in his mind. The car was clean, expensive, and perfectly centered between the work lines, but it had no intake tag hanging from the mirror, no key envelope on the office counter, no work order on the clipboard, and no reason to be inside Harper Auto Works. Daniel walked around the Mercedes without touching it, careful to keep his hands away from the door handles, windows, and mirrors. The driver's seat was empty. The doors appeared closed. The vehicle looked undamaged. What mattered was not how nice it looked, but the fact that it had spent the night inside a private workshop without permission. Daniel opened the office, turned on the security monitor, and pulled up the previous night's footage. At 8:43, Margaret Caldwell drove into the open bay. At 8:44, she stepped out. At 8:45, she looked directly at the storage policy sign beside the office door. At 8:46, she walked out toward the clubhouse. Daniel watched the sequence twice, then exported the clips from the front camera, the bay camera, and the office camera. He named each file by date, time, and angle, then created a folder called Caldwell Unauthorized Storage. After that, he photographed the Mercedes from every side, including the service bay floor, the posted policy, the closed garage door, and the empty work order rack. He was not angry yet. Anger came with confusion, and this was not confusing. This was exactly the situation the policy had been written for. At 7:28, his first customer arrived and stopped outside, surprised to see the bay occupied. Daniel met her at the door, apologized, and explained that an unauthorized vehicle had blocked the bay overnight. He moved her appointment to the side bay, which took extra time and forced him to delay the next job. Then he returned to the office and opened the indoor storage invoice template. He entered the posted daily rate, the date and time the vehicle entered, the lack of work order, the lack of intake form, and the release requirement. He did not add insults. He did not add penalties that were not on the sign. He used the exact language from the policy Margaret had looked at before walking away. At 8:05, Daniel emailed Margaret with the subject line "Unauthorized Vehicle Storage at Harper Auto Works." He wrote that her Mercedes had been left inside the workshop without permission, intake documentation, or work order, that the vehicle was documented by security footage, that it remained untouched and secured, and that release required signed acknowledgement, proof of ownership, valid identification, and payment of indoor storage charges according to the posted policy. He attached still images, not the full video, because he wanted to keep the message factual and controlled. Margaret replied 11 minutes later. Her message was short enough to show confidence and careless enough to become useful. "Daniel, I left it there for the community event. I will come by later. Please have it ready." Daniel saved the email, then responded with one sentence. "The vehicle is ready for release upon completion of the written procedure described in my previous message." He knew she would not like that answer. What he did not know was how quickly she would try to make the problem belong to everyone except herself. Margaret Caldwell arrived at Harper Auto Works just after 10:30 that Saturday morning, not with an apology or a signed release form, but with the careful posture of someone who expected a private business to become flexible the moment she entered it. She parked near the office door, stepped out in sunglasses and a pale weekend jacket, and looked through the glass toward the Mercedes as if Daniel Harper had placed it there to inconvenience her, rather than the other way around. Daniel had already prepared the release packet before she arrived. It included the storage invoice, the acknowledgement of unauthorized indoor storage, a copy of the posted policy, and a simple statement confirming that the vehicle had not been moved, serviced, opened, or altered by Harper Auto Works. When Margaret entered the office, she glanced at the papers and immediately pushed them back across the counter with 2 fingers. "I am not signing something that makes it sound like I did anything improper," she said. Daniel kept his hands on the counter and his voice calm. "The form does not say anything improper. It says the vehicle was left inside the workshop without permission or a work order, and that you are completing the release procedure." Margaret gave a small laugh, but there was no warmth in it. She said Daniel was choosing paperwork over neighborly cooperation, then repeated that the Mercedes had been left there because of a community charity event, as if the word charity could erase the part where she had been told no the day before. Daniel reminded her that the workshop was not event parking, not clubhouse storage, and not part of Willow Creek Estates. Margaret's face tightened when he said that. She told him he was damaging his relationship with the community and that residents would remember how he treated their homeowners association president. Daniel did not take the bait. He pointed to the policy board beside the office door and said the vehicle could be released as soon as the form was signed and the posted storage charge was paid. Margaret asked if he was seriously going to keep her Mercedes inside over a few $100. Daniel corrected her gently. "I am not keeping it over the fee. You are leaving it here by refusing the release procedure." That sentence changed the room. Margaret stopped pretending this was friendly disagreement and began treating it like a power contest. She said she would contact the board, the management company, and anyone else necessary to make sure Daniel understood that businesses near Willow Creek Estates depended on community goodwill. Daniel answered that he would provide the same documents to anyone who asked. Margaret left without signing, without paying, and without the Mercedes. 15 minutes later, Daniel received an email copy to the Willow Creek Estates board. Margaret wrote that a neighboring business owner was refusing to release her vehicle after a community event, applying unreasonable charges, and creating unnecessary conflict with the association. She did not mention that she had asked permission and been denied. She did not mention the storage policy. She did not mention the camera showing her reading it. Daniel read the message once, saved it in the Caldwell unauthorized storage folder, and replied only with the release requirements and attached still images from the footage. By Sunday afternoon, the second daily storage charge had been added to the invoice. By Sunday night, Margaret still had not signed. And by Monday morning, when she returned to the office window demanding immediate release, Daniel already had a thicker folder, a cleaner timeline, and a problem she could no longer rename as a misunderstanding. By Monday morning, the Mercedes had become more than an inconvenience inside Harper Auto Works. It was taking up the main service bay during the busiest part of Daniel Harper's week, forcing him to rearrange jobs that had been scheduled days in advance and explain to paying customers why a vehicle that was not being repaired was sitting in the most important space in the shop. Daniel moved a brake inspection into the smaller side bay, delayed a suspension job until the afternoon, and turned away a fleet customer who needed 2 vans checked before a delivery route. He documented each change with the same calm precision he had used from the beginning. The point was not to make Margaret Caldwell look worse. The point was to show exactly what her decision was costing the business, while she refused the simple procedure that would have released her own car. At 9:18, Daniel updated the invoice with the third daily indoor storage charge. At 9:26, he added notes about the lost fleet appointment. At 9:34, he printed the email chain showing that Margaret had never disputed leaving the Mercedes inside the workshop. She had only disputed whether consequences should apply to her. That difference mattered. Just before 10 o'clock, Daniel received another message from Margaret, this time copied to the full Willow Creek Estates board and the community management office. She wrote that Harper Auto Works was holding her Mercedes in a manner that felt punitive, that Daniel was using a business policy to damage community relations, and that the Homeowners Association should review whether a nearby workshop with such hostile practices deserved resident support. Daniel read the message slowly, then noticed what she had done. She was no longer asking for the Mercedes through the release process. She was trying to turn resident opinion into pressure. He opened a fresh reply, attached the posted storage policy, the still image of Margaret looking at that policy, the earlier note documenting her denied request, the release packet, and the updated invoice. Then he wrote that the vehicle remained available for release upon signed acknowledgement, proof of ownership, valid identification, and payment of posted charges. He added that Harper Auto Works had not moved, opened, serviced, or altered the vehicle, and that the only reason it remained inside the workshop was the owner's refusal to complete the written release procedure. He sent it to everyone Margaret had copied. For nearly 20 minutes, nobody answered. Then a board member named Linda Carver replied privately to Daniel and asked whether the workshop was within the association boundary. Daniel sent the property map. 5 minutes later, the management office requested the full timeline. Daniel sent that too. By noon, Margaret had stopped emailing him directly and started calling board members. Daniel knew because Linda forwarded one of Margaret's messages asking for an emergency meeting that evening at the clubhouse to address what she called a threat to community partnership. Daniel almost admired the phrase. It made unauthorized indoor storage sound like diplomacy. But phrases would not move the Mercedes, and they would not erase the footage. So Daniel spent the afternoon preparing the record in order: zoning approval, business license, property map, policy signed photographs, camera clips, denied request note, release instructions, invoice, customer schedule impact, and every email Margaret had sent. At 5:45, he locked the office, checked the Mercedes one more time on the camera feed, and drove toward the clubhouse with the folder on the passenger seat. Margaret wanted a public room. Daniel was bringing the reason public rooms sometimes go silent. The clubhouse meeting began with Margaret Caldwell standing before the board as if she were presenting a community emergency instead of explaining why her Mercedes was still inside a private workshop. She thanked everyone for coming on short notice, then described Daniel Harper as a nearby business owner who had chosen hostility over partnership, paperwork over good faith, and fees over neighborly judgment. She said the Mercedes had been left at Harper Auto Works during a crowded charity event, that the vehicle was secure and harmless, and that Daniel was using a technical policy to pressure the president of Willow Creek Estates. Daniel sat quietly through every sentence. He did not interrupt when Margaret said the situation reflected poorly on business relations. He He did not react when she suggested residents should reconsider whether they wanted to support a shop that treated community leaders this way. He only waited for the moment when a story built on missing details had to stand beside the record. Linda Carver, who had asked for the property map earlier, finally turned to Daniel and asked him to explain his side. Daniel stood, placed the folder on the front table, and began with the simplest fact. Harper Auto Works was not on association property. It sat on a separate commercial parcel, with a separate lease, separate insurance, and a posted indoor storage policy that applied to every vehicle inside the workshop. He handed out copies of the business license, zoning approval, and property map. Then he placed a photograph of the policy sign on the table. Unauthorized vehicles left inside the workshop will be billed daily as indoor storage until released through written procedure. The room became quieter when he explained that Margaret had asked to store the Mercedes inside the shop the day before the event and that he had refused in person. He showed the note he had written that same day documenting the request, the refusal, and the fact that the policy was shown to her. Margaret tried to speak, but Linda asked her to wait. Daniel connected his laptop to the clubhouse screen and opened the security footage. The first clip showed Friday evening at 8:43, the garage door open for a delivery, the bay lights on, and Margaret's Mercedes turning into the workshop while Daniel was out of sight in the back storage room. No employee waved her in. No one opened the door for her. No one handed her an intake form. The second clip showed Margaret stepping out, looking around, and pausing beside the policy board. Daniel froze the image there. The storage policy was clear behind her shoulder. A resident in the back whispered, "She saw it." Daniel did not repeat the comment. He did not need to. The third clip showed Margaret walking toward the clubhouse and leaving the Mercedes behind. Then Daniel showed the Saturday email where Margaret wrote that she left it there for the community event and told him to have it ready. The wording mattered because it was not a denial. It was an admission wrapped in expectation. Margaret's face tightened as the board members read the release packet, the invoice, and the message showing that the vehicle had been available for release since Saturday morning upon signed acknowledgement, proof of ownership, valid identification, and payment of posted charges. The management representative asked whether Daniel had moved, opened, or serviced the vehicle. Daniel answered no. The Mercedes remained untouched, secured, and documented inside the main bay only because Margaret had refused the written procedure. Linda looked at Margaret and asked why the association had been copied into a personal release issue involving a vehicle stored without permission outside association property. For the first time that evening, Margaret did not have a polished answer ready. She said the matter affected community relations. Daniel looked at the screen, then at the folder, then back at the board. Respectfully, he said, "Community relations did not park the Mercedes in my workshop. Permission did not exist, and policy did." The room stayed quiet after Daniel Harper finished speaking, and that quiet did more damage to Margaret Caldwell than an argument ever could. For weeks, she had been able to shape conversations around words like cooperation, appearance, and community standards, but the screen behind Daniel still showed the frozen image of her standing beside the policy board before walking away from the Mercedes. Linda Carver asked the management representative to confirm the property boundary one more time for the record. He looked at the map, then at the documents Daniel had provided, and stated clearly that Harper Auto Works was outside Willow Creek Estates, outside association control, and outside any parking or storage authority the board could claim. Margaret tried to soften the moment by saying she had acted during a crowded community event and never intended to create a formal dispute. Daniel did not respond. He simply let the email she had sent on Saturday sit on the table in front of everyone, the one where she wrote that she had left the vehicle there for the event and expected it ready. Linda then asked whether the board had approved using Daniel's workshop for vehicle storage. No one answered yes. Another board member, Thomas Reed, asked whether association funds could be used to pay the invoice since Margaret had described the situation as event-related. The management representative answered before Margaret could. He said paying the invoice with association money could make it appear that the board had authorized a private vehicle to be stored without permission on commercial property, which the documents did not support. That sentence changed the temperature in the room. Residents who had arrived expecting to hear about a hostile business owner were now watching the board separate itself from its own president. Margaret straightened in her chair and said the board should be careful about undermining leadership in front of outsiders. Linda looked at her and said leadership did not include copying the board into a personal vehicle release dispute after refusing the written procedure. Daniel closed his folder slowly. The Mercedes was still available for release tonight, he said. The amount is the posted storage charge through today. The acknowledgement only confirms the vehicle was left without permission and released untouched. Margaret said she would not sign language that made her look irresponsible. Daniel answered that the document described the condition of release, not her character. That made a few residents glance down, because the evidence had already done the rest. After several minutes of board discussion, Linda stated that Willow Creek Estates would not pressure Harper Auto Works, would not reimburse Margaret, and would not send any resident notice criticizing the business. She also requested that all future communication with neighboring businesses go through the board as a whole, not through Margaret alone. Margaret's face remained composed, but the control behind it had started to crack. The meeting ended without applause, without shouting, and without the public victory she had expected. Outside the clubhouse, under the parking lot lights, Margaret approached Daniel with her phone in her hand and asked if he would remove one day of storage if she handled the release immediately. Daniel said the invoice matched the posted policy and the vehicle had occupied the main bay through Monday. She stared at him for a long second, then said he was enjoying this. Daniel shook his head. I am losing a service bay, he said. There is nothing enjoyable about that. An hour later, Margaret arrived at Harper Auto Works with valid identification, proof of ownership, and payment from her personal account. She signed the acknowledgement with a stiff hand, refusing to look directly at the policy board beside the office door. Daniel opened the bay only after the paperwork was complete. The Mercedes rolled out without a scratch, but Margaret left without the thing she had come in with, the unquestioned belief that her title could make other people's rules disappear. The next morning, Harper Auto Works felt lighter before Daniel Harper even turned on the office lights. The main service bay was empty again. The floor was clean where the Mercedes had sat for 3 days, and the first customer of the morning was able to pull straight into the space without Daniel apologizing, rearranging, or explaining why someone else's entitlement had become part of the schedule. He opened the garage door at 7 o'clock, set his coffee on the counter, and filed the Caldwell unauthorized storage folder in the locked cabinet with the invoice marked paid, the acknowledgement signed, the footage saved, and the release record complete. To Daniel, that should have been the end of it. The car was returned untouched. The policy had been followed. The shop was back to work. But Margaret Caldwell had made the mistake of dragging the board into a personal problem, and once the board saw the paperwork, they could not pretend it was only about one Mercedes. 2 days later, Linda Carver sent Daniel a short message thanking him for attending the meeting and confirming that Willow Creek Estates would update its communication policy for all board members. Daniel did not ask for details, but by the end of the week, several residents told him what had changed. Margaret was no longer allowed to send association-wide messages about neighboring businesses without board review. Any complaint involving property outside the homeowners association boundary had to go through the management office first. Board members were reminded in writing that their titles did not give them authority over private commercial parcels, contractors, shops, parking spaces, storage areas, or business policies. It was the kind of formal language that sounded boring until a person understood who had made it necessary. Margaret tried to frame the changes as a procedural update, but everyone in Willow Creek Estates knew the timing. At the next monthly meeting, Thomas Reed asked for a review of Margaret's use of her position in disputes involving outside businesses. Linda supported it. 2 other board members joined her. Margaret stayed composed, but the room no longer moved around her the way it once had. People asked direct questions. They wanted to know why the board had been copied into her vehicle release issue. They wanted to know why she had described a private storage invoice as a threat to the community. They wanted to know whether she had used her title to pressure a business after being personally denied permission. Margaret answered with polished phrases, but polished phrases were weaker after everyone had watched a video of her reading the policy before leaving the car behind. By the following month, she stepped down as president, saying she wanted to focus on personal priorities and allow the board to move forward without distraction. Daniel heard about it from a customer who mentioned it while dropping off a pickup for service. He did not smile much. He only nodded, wrote down the mileage, and went back to work. A week later, he added a small sign under the storage policy in the office. It read, "Permission first. Paperwork always. Customers noticed it and sometimes asked about the story, but Daniel never gave them a dramatic version. He said only that the policy had done what it was written to do. Across the rear road, the clubhouse still held events, residents still walked past the shop, and Willow Creek Estates still had rules for its own neighborhood. But the invisible line between their authority and Daniel's property had become visible to everyone. The Mercedes left the workshop without a scratch, but Margaret's power did not leave with it. It stayed behind in the file, in the footage, in the invoice, and in the policy she thought her title could ignore.